Excuse me. Olia stopped at the entrance to first class and turned. Victoria Hale stood beside the curtain. Yes, may I see your boarding pass? Olia smiled and handed it over. Of course. Victoria looked at the pass, then at Alt, then back at the pass. Olia noticed the pause. Is there a problem? No, not a problem. Victoria's voice stayed polite, but her eyes moved over the backpack and sweatshirt. I just need to make sure you're in the right cabin. I am. Victoria checked the ticket again. Olia pointed. Seat 3A. I can see that. Okay. Olia waited. Behind her a passenger cleared his throat. A woman glanced over, then looked away. Victoria lowered the ticket. Is your father traveling with you? Olia hesitated. No, are you sure? Yes. Victoria's expression tightened. Olia kept her voice calm. I bought the ticket. I didn't mean it's okay. The words were quiet, but they made Victoria stop. Olia stepped forward. Can I take my seat? Victoria moved aside. Yes. Olia walked to 3A and placed her backpack beneath the seat. She could feel eyes following her. Even though nobody spoke, Olia sat quietly. She knew what it felt like when someone checked a ticket because rules required it. This felt different. Maybe she imagined. It may be Victoria had simply been careful still. Something inside her whispered that the question had never really been about the ticket. Victoria passed her row. Finally, she stopped. Would you like something to drink? Olia looked up. Water, please. Victoria nodded. Of course. Olia accepted the cup. Thank you. Victoria said nothing. She walked away. Olia looked down at her boarding pass. Said first class. She wondered whether everyone around her believed she belonged there. While everyone stayed silent, I bought the ticket, Olia said again, keeping her voice steady. Victoria looked at her for another second. You said your father arranged it? Yes, and he told you to sit here? Yes, he did. Olia pointed gently toward the seat. 3A. Victoria glanced at the boarding pass. I can see that. Then, is there a problem? Victoria did not answer immediately. Nearby, a man lowered his phone just enough to watch. A woman across the aisle looked toward Olia, then quickly returned her attention to her screen. Nobody said anything. Victoria turned toward the small service panel and scanned the pass. The system beeped. Accepted. She looked at the screen, then at Olia. Then back at the screen. Olia waited. It's valid. Victoria said quietly. I know. Victoria's jaw tightened. There is no mistake with the reservation. Olia nodded. Okay. The words sounded simple, but embarrassment had already begun replacing confusion. Victoria checked the screen again, as if another answer might appear. Olia watched her. If the ticket is valid, she asked. Why am I being questioned? Victoria looked up. I'm just doing my job. Olia lowered her voice. I understand. What she no longer felt that she understood. The passengers nearby had become strangely still. Their silence was not loud, but Olia could feel it. Every glance seemed to ask the same question without anyone having the courage to speak it. Victoria stepped closer. Your father is wealthy. Olia frowned slightly. Yes, very wealthy. Olia did not know why that mattered. Suppose Victoria studied her face. Olia finally understood that the problem was not the ticket. The problem was that Victoria had. We'd expected someone else to be sitting in that seat. Olia swallowed and looked toward the window. Remembered her father's words before she left home. Just enjoy your flight. You earned the trip. At the time, she had smiled. Now those words felt heavier. She had followed every rule. She had arrived early. She had shown her ticket. The system had confirmed her reservation. Still, something remained wrong in Victoria's eyes. Olia looked back at her. Do you need anything else from me? Victoria hesitated. No. Olia nodded. Then, may I sit down? Victoria stepped aside. Olia returned to her seat, but the feeling of belonging had changed. Behind her, someone whispered something too softly to hear. Olia did not turn around. She refused to let their silence define her yet. She placed her boarding pass carefully in her backpack for the first time. She realized that a valid ticket could prove where she was allowed to sit. It could not force someone to believe she belonged there, and that was the part that hurt. Olia walked toward the gate with an airline employee beside her. She kept her eyes forward, holding a phone tightly in one hand and a backpack strap in the other. Behind her, first class had gone quiet. A few passengers watched her leave. Others stared at their screens, pretending nothing had happened. No one asked why she was being removed. Olia felt every silence. She reached the gate and stopped near the window. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry in front of strangers. Her phone rang. Daddy. Daniel heard the tremble immediately. Where are you? Near the gate. What happened? Olia took a breath. They made me leave first class. Daniel said nothing. They said I didn't belong there. His voice remained calm. Did you do anything wrong? No. Are you sure? Yes, Daddy. Olia wiped her cheek. I showed them my ticket. It was valid. They still kept questioning me. Daniel closed his eyes. Then he asked, did anyone explain why? No. That answer stayed with him. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Olia shook her head. Though he could not see her, I just wanted to sit down. I know. She looked back toward the cabin entrance. Daddy. They made me feel like I was pretending to be someone I'm not. Daniel's silence became heavier. While Olia waited, Victoria returned to the crew area. She opened the incident report and began typing. Passenger became disruptive. She wrote. She paused, then added, Passenger refused instructions. The words looked official. They also erased everything that came before them. The supervisor read the report. Any security issue? No, Victoria answered. Any ticket problem? No. He nodded and approved the report. The institution had already chosen its version, but nearby, a security supervisor reviewed the boarding record. He checked the scan.valid. He checked the seat. Correct. He checked the security log. Nothing. He frowned. This doesn't match. He quietly saved the record before closing the file. No announcement followed. No confrontation. Just evidence preserved by someone who sensed the story was incomplete. Daniel listened as his daughter finished explaining. He looked at the documents beside him. Daddy, Olia asked. I'm here. What are you going to do? Daniel paused. Let the truth speak first. Then he ended the call for several seconds. He remained completely still. His anger was real, but anger would not be allowed to choose his next move. He did not mention his wealth or threaten anyone. He simply asked for every record connected to the incident. If the airline had nothing to hide, those records would prove it. If it did, they would speak louder than his anger ever could possibly. The records arrived before Daniel finished his coffee. He read them without speaking, moving from page to page while the room remained quiet. Olia's experience was no longer sitting alone in his mind. It was beginning to look like part of something larger. His attorney looked at him. Daniel, your name is already connected to this airline. I know if they discover you're investigating personally, they'll change how they respond. Daniel nodded. Then they shouldn't know. The attorney studied him. You could call the board right now. I could try and make this disappear. Daniel looked down at Olia's boarding record. That is exactly what I don't want. He remembered something she had said earlier. She had not asked him to punish Victoria. She had only wanted someone to explain why a valid ticket had not been enough. Daniel leaned back. When I built my company, I wanted systems that treated every passenger the same. His attorney stayed silent, not because everyone has money. Daniel continued, because everyone deserves the same basic respect. Another file opened. This one contained complaints from previous years. A black father questioned about his seat. A young woman asked to prove her reservation twice. An elderly passenger escorted away after objecting to a staff member's treatment. Different names. Different flights. Similar language. Daniel's expression tightened. Who reviewed these? We're still tracing that. Do it carefully. We can bring in senior executives. No. The answer came quickly. His attorney paused. Daniel pointed toward the reports. If the people who normally protect the company know we're watching, we'll learn what they want us to see. So what do you want? Daniel looked at him. I want the truth before anyone has time to prepare it. The room fell still. He asked his team to contact former passengers independently. He wanted their original stories. He wanted dates, names, locations, witnesses, and anything they had saved. Then he gave one final instruction. Don't tell them who I am. His attorney understood. Daniel was not hiding because he was afraid of the airline. He was hiding because he wanted to know what happened when nobody believed a powerful person was listening. Across town, airline executives were already discussing the incident as a minor customer dispute. They did not know Daniel's name had entered the investigation. They did not know his company touched systems used throughout their network, and they certainly did not know that the man reviewing their records had enough influence to make senior officers answer difficult questions. Daniel closed the final file. Find out what happens when nobody important is watching. No one spoke for once. The silence did not protect the institution. It was waiting for the truth. The room had become quieter since Daniel gave the instruction. No one rushed to defend the airline. No one called an executive. His investigators simply opened another folder, then another, following the trail backward. The oldest complaint was dated 18 months before Olia's flight. Black physician, one investigator said. First class, valid ticket. Daniel looked up, read it. The investigator began. The passenger had been questioned at the gate, then questioned again before boarding. He had shown identification, his reservation, and his boarding pass. Everything matched. Still, the employee continued asking where he was traveling, who had purchased the ticket, and whether he was certain he was in the correct line. Daniel listened without interrupting. What happened afterward? The airline apologized. Anything else? No disciplinary action. Daniel looked at the report again. Why was he questioned? We don't have an answer. That sentence stayed in the room. Daniel had heard polished explanations from executives before. They usually arrived quickly, carefully shaped to make a painful event sound smaller. But this report contained no real explanation at all. The missing reason mattered because nobody had been forced to provide one. The employee had acted, the passenger had complied, and the company had moved on without asking the simplest question. Why had suspicion appeared in the first place? Daniel wanted answers before anything else happened. Now, the next file involved a black family traveling together. The mother, father, and two children had been standing in a premium boarding line when an employee approached them. They were told they were in the wrong place, the investigator explained. Were they? No. Did their tickets confirm first class? Yes, Daniel leaned back. Then why were they moved? There isn't a recorded reason. Photographs had been attached to the complaint. They showed other passengers entering the same line without interruption. The parents had not argued their children were. Watching Daniel stared at that detail longer than the others. They apologized later, the investigator said. Daniel nodded slowly. After the children had already seen it. No one answered. The third complaint belonged to a military veteran. He had been stopped twice during boarding. His identification was valid. His ticket was valid. Security found nothing unusual. Why twice? Daniel asked. That's the problem. The report contained no clear explanation. The final note said that passenger accepted an apology and continued his journey. Daniel read that sentence again. Every case ends with an apology. His investigator nodded. And then closed. The files were placed side by side. One passenger questioned repeatedly. One family redirected without reason. One veteran searched twice. Different airports, different employees, different dates, the same ending. Daniel pointed at the reports. Who reviewed them? Local supervisors who checked for a pattern. No one thought that answer changed the room. Daniel had expected mistakes. He had expected poor judgment from individuals. What he had not expected was how neatly every complaint disappeared. An apology became the final step. A closed file became proof that nothing remained to investigate. A passenger left embarrassed, while the institution returned to normal. Daniel finally stood. One incident can be explained, he said. A second can be dismissed. But this, he looked across the table, this is a system teaching itself not to listen. The investigators remained silent. Daniel did not ask him to expose anyone yet. Keep going. We will. Don't warn the airline. Understood. Daniel gathered the reports and looked once more at Olia's file. Her complaint was not the beginning. It was the moment someone finally decided to look backward, and somewhere inside those forgotten records, the truth was waiting. The investigator's last sentence still hung in the room. It did not require everyone to agree. It required people to stay quiet. Daniel looked at the newest witness statement. Victoria's record was not simply clean. It had been kept clean. Her performance reviews praised her professionalism. Her awards praised her patience. Her supervisors described her as dependable. Yet beneath those polished pages were complaints that never seemed to reach the same evaluation system. One investigator looked up. There are more. Daniel's expression tightened. How many? Enough to change the picture. The files showed a pattern. Black passengers questioned more closely. Boarding decisions challenged without clear reason. Complaints redirected until responsibility became unclear. Daniel pointed to Victoria's evaluation, and none of this affected her score. No. A former co-worker's statement sat beside it. She had once watched Victoria treat a black passenger differently. When she questioned the decision, a supervisor had pulled her aside. Don't create problems for the company. Daniel read the sentence twice. She stayed quiet because she needed her job, the investigator said. Daniel nodded. That doesn't make her responsible for what Victoria did. The room became still. For years, silence had protected people differently. Some were afraid, some were comfortable, some simply trusted the system more than the passenger standing in front of them. Daniel closed the folder. Keep documenting. Across the airport, Victoria knew none of this. She greeted passengers with the same practiced smile she had used for years. A supervisor complimented her work. Another mentioned that her latest evaluation was excellent. Victoria smiled. Thank you. She believed those words meant she was safe. She did not know former complaints were being reopened. She did not know investigators were comparing reports. She did not know supervisors were being asked questions they had avoided for years. And she certainly did not know that the people who once protected her were beginning to step away. Her reputation still looked perfect from the outside, but behind it, the first cracks had already appeared, and this time, nobody was rushing to cover them. The room stayed quiet after the investigator mentioned Linda Graves. Daniel did not react immediately. He looked at the files spread across the table, then at the signatures beneath them. Show me the process, he said. The investigator opened a diagram. Complaints entered customer service. Sensitive cases moved to regional management. Some went to legal, others returned to customer relations. And then, Daniel asked, closed. Who decides where they go? Different people. Daniel frowned. So nobody owns the decision. That seems to be the design. The words settled heavily. A complaint could move 3 departments without ever reaching an executive willing to ask why it kept happening. Each transfer looked normal by itself. Together they formed a path that made serious concerns disappear. Daniel picked up one report. This passenger said she was treated differently because of her race. The investigator nodded. What did the final record say? Customer discomfort following a misunderstanding. Daniel looked at him. That's not what she reported. No. Then who changed it? We're still tracing that. Daniel set the paper down. The language was almost gentle. That made it worse. There were no insults in the files. No obvious threats. No statement anyone could easily point to and call hateful. Instead, the reports used words like misunderstanding, isolated concern, and communication issue. A black passenger who described humiliation became uncomfortable. An employee who reported unequal treatment became concerned. A serious allegation became an incident. The words reduced to the weight of what people had experienced, until the complaint itself seemed unreasonable. Daniel exhaled slowly. You can hide a lot behind polite language. His investigator nodded. Former employees confirmed it. One described learning never to write that a passenger had been treated differently because of race. What were you told to write? Customer concern. Why? Because that was safer. Safer for whom? The former employee hesitated. The company. Another employee admitted that questioning the wording could bring meetings with management. People learned quickly. They learned which words protected careers. They learned which words created trouble. And eventually, they stopped saying what they actually saw. Daniel listened carefully. I don't blame every employee, he said. Fear changes people. His investigator looked at him, but fear can also protect a system. Daniel nodded. That is what we need to understand. The next files showed how the system handled passengers after they complained. They received apologies. Professional ones. We value your experience. We regret any misunderstanding. Your concern has been addressed, but there were no meaningful findings, no explanation, no clear consequence. The apology ended the conversation without answering the question. Daniel, read one message aloud. Your concern has been resolved. He lowered the paper. Resolved how? Nobody answered. The investigation continued until one name began appearing again and again. Linda Graves. Her approval appeared beneath sensitive complaint closures across several years. Sometimes she reviewed the decision. Sometimes her office signed off on the classification. The pattern did not prove she personally ordered discrimination, but her office sat close to the machinery. Daniel studied her signature. Find every case connected to her. His investigator nodded. Do we contact her? Not yet. Why? Daniel looked at the files. Because if she knows we're coming, she'll prepare an explanation. He closed the folder. For now, let the records speak. And for the first time, the hidden system had a name that was not Victoria. It was not one angry employee. It was something larger, quieter and harder to confront. A structure built from small decisions, careful language, fearful workers, and leaders who had learned that silence was easier than truth for years. The folder remained open on Daniel's desk. Linda Graves' name appearing beneath decision after decision. The discovery changed the direction of the investigation, but Daniel did not treat it as a victory. A name could explain a pattern. It could not explain everything. Tell me about Linda, he said. His investigator answered carefully. 20 years with the airline, senior executive for customer operations, highly respected, very connected. Connected to whom? Board members, regional directors, legal public relations. Daniel looked back at the documents. So she could control what people saw. She could control what people saw. She could influence what they saw. That distinction mattered. Linda had built her reputation by staying calm when everyone else panicked. When complaints threatened the airline, she did not shout or make dramatic demands. She scheduled meetings. She requested revised reports. She asked whether certain language was necessary. The result was often the same. The complaint became smaller. The risk became manageable. The passenger became a statistic. One internal document described the complaint as a potential reputation exposure. Daniel stopped reading. What does that mean? It means they were measuring the chance of media attention, not the seriousness of the complaint. No, the room went silent. Another file showed a list of incidents ranked by public relations risk. Some complaints involving racial treatment were marked low priority, because no journalist had contacted the airline. Daniel stared at the page. So the question wasn't, did this happen? His investigator shook his head. It was, could anyone find out? Daniel leaned back. That was the wall Linda had built. Not a wall of threats. A wall of procedure. A recovered email made the picture sharper. We can't let this become a pattern. Daniel read the sentence twice. At first, that sounds reasonable, he said. Read the next page. He did. Linda was discussing how several complaints might appear connected if handled together. Her solution was to keep each incident separate, assign different managers, and avoid language suggesting a broader issue. Daniel slowly lowered the paper. She knew. We can't say she knew everything. Daniel nodded. Double quotes. No, but she knew enough to be afraid of the pattern. The investigators found what happened to employees who questioned those decisions. One had been transferred. Another had been passed over for advancement. A third had resigned after months of unexplained pressure. None of their records said punishment. Each contained ordinary administrative reasons. Daniel understood that is how you silence people, without telling them to be silent. His investigator looked down. Most employees figured it out. They watched what happened to others yet and learned. Yes, Daniel. closed his eyes briefly. He thought about Olia, standing at that first-class door, holding a valid ticket while people decided she looked out of place. Victoria had made the decision, but Linda had helped create a place where such decisions could survive, and somewhere above them, people who had never met Olia had already benefited from the silence, because the system rewarded clean numbers more readily than uncomfortable truth ever. Fully. Daniel opened his eyes. Find everyone who reported concerns about Linda's department. We already have a list, then expanded. How far? Every connection. The investigator hesitated. It could reach senior leadership. Daniel nodded. That is where it needs to go. He gathered the reports into one stack. Removing Victoria might satisfy the public. Removing Linda might satisfy the board. Neither would be enough. Daniel looked at the final document. That the question isn't who made the mistake. His voice remained quiet. It's who made the mistake. Safe. No one answered. They didn't need to. The investigation had just moved upward. The statement landed badly. The video had spread beyond the original passenger's account. Reporters began asking questions. Ali's face appeared. She was not shouting. She was not fighting. She was simply walking away. One investigator placed the airline statement beside the video. They called it standard procedure. Daniel, read the sentence in the footage. It shows a teenager being removed after her ticket was accepted. Daniel looked toward the screen. What are people saying? That the explanation doesn't match what they see. Comments filled the video. Then, people began sharing their own experiences. A woman described being stopped at an airport despite having a valid ticket. Another traveler responded with a similar story. Soon the comments were no longer only about Aaliyah. They were becoming a record. Daniel watched quietly. His investigator spoke softly. They're finding the pattern themselves. Daniel nodded. That's what happens when people finally see what they thought was only happening to them. Executives were becoming uncomfortable. The public statement had been designed to close the conversation. Instead, it had opened a larger one. A communications director rushed into Linda Graves's office. The video is still climbing. Linda looked up. How high? Millions. And the comments. They're asking about other incidents. Linda's expression changed. Now, strangers were connecting them. Her wall was beginning to fail in public. Linda stared at the screen. For once, she had no polished phrase ready. A notification appeared. Journalists had requested an interview. Then, another. The 20-second video had become something larger than 20 seconds. That it had become a question the airline could no longer redirect. The silence that protected the company was now working against them. Instead, it gave the public more reasons to ask questions. A journalist replayed the 20-second clip during a morning broadcast. Aaliyah appeared beside security, her small backpack against her shoulder. Then the airline statement appeared beneath the footage. Standard procedures. The journalist paused. What procedure requires her removal? The question spread quickly. Inside the airline, executives watched in silence. The explanation now sounded empty. Linda Graves received another message. Media wants comment. She stared at the screen. What exactly are they asking? Why was she removed? Use the statement. We already did. They want more. For the first time, Linda's usual calm showed a crack. Meanwhile, Daniel's investigators worked. One investigator placed several complaint files beside screenshots of the viral video. The public is finding the same connections we found. Daniel studied the images. Good. His investigator looked surprised. You're not worried about the attention? Yes. Daniel shook his head. I'm worried about what happens when attention disappears. He knew public outrage could fade. Headlines could move on. People could forget. Evidence was different. Evidence stayed. Another notification appeared. A former employee had contacted investigators after seeing the video. She claimed she had witnessed similar treatment and still had copies of internal messages. Daniel read the message. Ask her to preserve everything. Should we bring her in? Not yet. Protect her identity first. Across the country, passengers posted experiences. Some stories were old, some were recent. Different airports, different employees, different years, but the same question kept appearing. Why did nobody listen? Daniel watched the list without celebrating his daughter's humiliation. Had opened something larger than he expected. The air could no longer control the story by controlling the language the video had already escaped. Now, every unanswered question was pulling another piece of the hidden system into the light. The video did what the airline feared most. It gave forgotten experiences a place to gather. Former passengers began posting. One woman shared an old boarding pass and described being questioned 3 times before entering first class. A father posted an unanswered complaint from years earlier. Another traveler remembered being asked whether he was sure he had purchased his seat. None of them knew each other, yet their stories carried the same uncomfortable feeling. For years, each person had thought their experience was too small to matter. Now people were listening. Then the screenshots arrived. Old emails, closed complaints, polite apologies. One family showed a message saying their concern had been resolved. Even though nobody had explained what happened, another passenger posted a complaint number with no follow-up. The details were different, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. People began comparing dates, airports, and descriptions. A comment appeared beneath one post. "This happened to my family too," then another, "and mine," then 10 more. The internet was doing what the airline had avoided doing, connecting the stories. Soon, former employees entered the conversation. Some people used their real names, others hid behind anonymous accounts because they were afraid of professional consequences. One former supervisor wrote that workers were often encouraged to avoid language that could make an incident look bigger than it was. Another remembered being told not to create problems for management. A former customer service employee described complaints being transferred until passengers stopped responding. The public finally, "I understood something important, that silence had not happened by accident, that had been learned." Journalists noticed. Reporters began contacting former employees and requesting internal records. They asked the airline specific questions about complaint handling, employee discipline, and repeated allegations involving black passengers. The official responses remained careful. "We take these concerns seriously. We are reviewing the matter." But reporters wanted answers, not phrases. Then documents began arriving in inboxes. A complaint, a revised report, an internal message, a disciplinary record. Each piece created another question. The investigation was no longer centered on one flight. It was becoming an examination of an institution. By the end of the week, Olia's image had traveled far beyond the airport. People discussed her story on television and online. Travelers compared experiences. Former employees kept speaking. Daniel watched quietly, did not want his daughter turned into a symbol, but he understood what the moment meant. The question was no longer whether Olia that belonged in first class. The question was why so many others had been made to feel they did not belong, and the airline could no longer answer that question with silence. The missing stories were finally visible, and nobody could erase them now. The investigation had begun with one girl, one flight, and one question. Now Daniel's team was looking across a map covered with airport names. The connections were not obvious at first. Different cities used different departments, managers, and complaint teams. Yet the same reporting structure appeared beneath them. What looked like separate failures was beginning to resemble one larger network. Daniel studied the infrastructure report as system diagrams filled the screen. His company's technology supported security checks, scheduling, compliance records, and information sharing across 152 airports. He never expected those connections to matter this way. The systems were designed to make travel safer. Now they were helping investigators see how institutions handled complaints. The technology had preserved evidence people thought would disappear. The scale of the connection was becoming clear. Investigators placed complaint records from airports beside one another. Different passengers, different dates, different employees. Still, the language repeated itself. Misunderstanding, isolated concern, customer dissatisfaction. Daniel noticed that the words sounded harmless until the stories were placed together. A passenger's humiliation could disappear inside one report. Hundreds of similar reports created something language could no longer hide. The pattern was no longer easy to dismiss. Old files created another connection. Complaints from airports far apart had been handled through similar steps. A passenger reported unequal treatment. A supervisor reviewed the matter. Management issued an apology. Then the file closed. Investigators traced reporting procedures and discovered shared habits for moving, softening, or delaying difficult cases. Distance had separated the airports, but the institutional response looked the same. The records were telling the same story. Daniel saw something that made the investigation personal. His company's systems had helped preserve records across airports. He had built technology to improve aviation, not expose its failures. He could no longer separate his responsibility from the evidence. Technology had done its job. People had decided what information meant. Recording a complaint was not the same as protecting the person. The evidence was becoming harder to ignore. The board meeting began without confidence. A screen displayed all 152 airports, each marked for unresolved complaints and reporting concerns. Nobody interrupted as the map filled with warnings. An executive whispered, "How many of these are confirmed?" The investigator answered, "We are still checking." That answer offered no comfort. One crisis had become a network. The room felt smaller with every marker. Then the private calls began. Regional executives contacted one another, asking what investigators found and whether complaints were reopened. Some ordered internal reviews. Others searched for records before requests arrived. No public announcement had been made. Fear moved through executive offices. People were no longer asking whether investigators would reach them. They were asking when. Nobody wanted to be the next airport named. The concern was spreading. The investigators asked one question. If similar complaints existed across airports, why had nobody recognized the pattern? The institutions had systems to collect information, but not enough courage to confront what that information revealed. Data moved efficiently. Accountability did not. Records survived, but responsibility stopped before reaching authority. That gap had allowed the pattern to survive. The evidence kept moving forward. Slowly, Daniel refused to let the investigation become a revenge story. He could have demanded action against Victoria or Linda, but the structure would remain. He instructed his team to follow the evidence, even when it affected his company. "We are not looking for someone to blame," he said. "We are looking for what failed." No one misunderstood. His restraint made the decision more serious. The number 152 had changed meaning. It represented 152 institutions that might soon have to examine complaints, employee protection, and passenger treatment. Daniel looked at the final report, then closed the folder. Another apology could not hide the next step. If the evidence held, the system would have to answer. The number itself had become a warning. The evidence kept moving forward. The room became quiet after Daniel finished reading the audit. His investigator broke the silence. "There's something else." Daniel looked up. "What?" The audit wasn't buried immediately. Someone reopened it 3 months later. Daniel's expression tightened. "Why?" "We don't know yet." They pulled the follow-up record onto the screen. The document showed the same concerns, followed by a recommendation for urgent correction. Beneath it was a management note. "Review during next cycle." Daniel stared at the sentence. "Next cycle?" "Yes, and how long was that?" 6 months, the investigator lowered his voice. "During those 6 months, 27 complaints were closed." Daniel leaned back. "So they knew. They knew enough to investigate, and they chose delay." No one answered. For the first time, Daniel understood that the audit was not simply proof of a warning. It was proof of time that had been months to act, months to change procedures, months to protect passengers like Olia instead. The company continued operating as though the warning belonged to someone else. His investigator opened another file. "Look at the approval, Daniel. Read the name. Linda Graves, the same executive, whose office had approved sensitive complaint closures." Daniel remained silent. "She received the audit," the investigator said. "I can see that." "And signed the follow-up." Daniel looked toward the window. The discovery did not make him angry in the way his team expected. It made him tired. Olia had asked why nobody believed her. Now he had part of the answer. Someone had believed that warning. Someone had read it. Someone had signed it, and still nothing changed. Daniel finally stood secure. "Every copy. We already have backups. Secure those too." The investigator nodded. Daniel closed the folder. "Carefully. This changes everything." Outside, the investigation moved on. Inside, the truth was impossible to explain away. Linda entered the boardroom with her usual calm expression. "This investigation has become personal," she said. "Daniel's daughter was involved. We cannot pretend his judgment is completely independent." Several executives nodded. For a moment, the room accepted the explanation. Reputation, influence, conflict of interest. Those questions were easier than asking whether Olia was treated fairly. Linda continued. You need to protect the company from an investigation driven by emotion." An investigator placed a sealed folder on the table. Linda looked at it briefly. "But everyone noticed." "What is that?" an executive asked. "Archived complaints. Those cases were already reviewed. Some were." The investigator opened the first file. "This complaint was submitted 3 years before Olia's flight." Silence followed. He read the details. A black passenger, a valid premium ticket, repeated questions about whether he belonged in the cabin. Linda folded her hands. That was an isolated issue. The investigator opened another file, and this one. Another passenger, another black traveler, another premium ticket, another unexplained challenge. A third file appeared. Different airports, different employees, similar treatment. An executive leaned forward. Why were these classified separately? The system required it. Linda looked toward counsel. They were individual complaints. The investigator placed several emails beside the files. "Then why did your office receive summaries of repeated concerns?" Linda recognized her name. Her expression shifted. "You knew about these," someone said. "I knew complaints existed, but did you know they were repeating?" She remained silent. The executives who had defended her earlier stopped speaking. Nobody shouted. They simply stopped protecting her. Linda looked around the table and understood the shift. The room was no longer asking how to protect the company. It was asking why she had protected the system. She lowered her eyes. The door she tried to close was already open. Victoria stared at the briefing screen. After everyone else had left, Daniel Carter. The name meant nothing to her at first. Then the next page loaded. Aviation technology, airport infrastructure, security systems, partnerships. She breathed. "He's her father?" she asked. The investigator nodded. Victoria looked away. She remembered Olia standing in first class, holding her boarding pass while Victoria questioned her. "Where are you supposed to sit?" Olia had answered calmly, "My assigned seat." Victoria had not believed her. Now the memory felt different, not because Daniel was wealthy, because Victoria understood that nothing about Olia's ticket had needed explanation. A supervisor entered quietly. "Victoria, you need to come with us." She turned. "Am I being suspended?" "We're still reviewing everything." Because of her father. The supervisor hesitated. No, because of what happened. The answer stayed with her. Victoria had trusted the company to protect her. Managers accepted her reports. Complaints disappeared. Now people stopped making eye contact. Conversations ended when she approached. Nobody insulted her. Nobody needed to. Her protection was gone. She looked at the screen. Daniel had not demanded her punishment. He had not threatened the airline. He had asked investigators to follow the evidence. That confused her more than anger would have. If he wanted to destroy me, she whispered, why hasn't he? The investigator answered from the doorway, because this was never supposed to be about your destruction. Victoria swallowed. Then what is it about? Whether you would have treated her differently if you knew who her father was. Silence filled it. Victoria knew the answer. She would have smiled. She would have welcomed Aaliyah. She would have trusted the ticket. That realization hurt more than the investigation. Aaliyah never needed Daniel's name to belong. Victoria had simply needed to see her as a passenger. The hearing room had grown quieter after Linda's final explanation. No one moved. Aaliyah watched everyone around her. Months earlier, she had walked through first class, wondering why nobody would believe her. Now the same people who once looked away were sitting beneath the weight of their own records. The lead investigator turned toward Linda. You said these were individual mistakes. Linda nodded slowly. Yes. He placed 3 reports beside each other. Then why do they follow the same process? Linda looked down. I can't speak for every employee. You were responsible for the department. We have the documents. The room fell silent. A former employee spoke from the witness table. We were told to keep complaints from becoming bigger than they needed to be. Another employee added, we knew which cases were supposed to disappear. That sentence changed the room, not because it was loud, because nobody could explain it away. The investigator opened the audit. This warning was delivered before Aaliyah's incident. Linda stared at the page. And you received it? Yes. What did you do? Linda's voice weakened. We discussed improvements. Where are those improvements? She had no answer. Daniel remained still beside his daughter. Aaliyah looked toward Linda for a second. Their eyes met. Victoria sat several rows behind her, unable to look away. The investigator closed the folder. Ms. Graves, this hearing is not asking whether you intended harm. Linda looked up. Then what are you asking? What you did after you knew harm was happening. Nobody spoke. Linda searched the room for someone willing to defend her. There was no one. The silence was not anger, it was distance. First time, Linda understood that the protection she depended on had not been loyalty. It had been silence. Now that silence was gone. The room had emptied slowly after the hearing, but Aaliyah remained seated until the voices disappeared. Victoria waited near the doorway, no longer surrounded by co-workers or supervisors without the uniform. She looked smaller. Aaliyah noticed the difference but said nothing. Victoria spoke. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. Aaliyah looked at her. I want to understand why. Victoria lowered her eyes. I told myself I was doing my job. That isn't what I asked. The answer left her silent. Aaliyah continued. Why did you look at me and decide I didn't belong? Victoria swallowed. I don't know. It was the first honest answer she had given. She remembered the boarding pass, the backpack, the way she had looked at Aaliyah before checking the ticket. She remembered how quickly suspicion had appeared and how easily she had trusted it. I should have checked the ticket and trusted the system, Victoria said. You did check it. Victoria looked up and it was valid. Yes. Then why did you keep questioning me? Victoria had no explanation that did not expose her. I made assumptions. Aaliyah nodded. That hurt. Victoria's eyes filled. I know, Aaliyah said. I don't think you did. Not then. The words landed harder than anger. Victoria looked toward the hallway. I treated you differently because of what I thought when I saw you. Aaliyah did not respond immediately. That silence forced Victoria to sit with the truth instead of escaping behind policy. I am sorry, Victoria said. Aaliyah stood and picked up her bag. I hope you never make another child feel that way. Victoria nodded. I won't. Aaliyah walked toward the door. Victoria remained behind, realizing the hardest consequence was not losing her position. It was finally understanding why she had used it. The room remained quiet after the final document appeared on the screen. Linda stared at the dates. Months before Aaliyah's flight, years before the investigation became public. She recognized the signatures. I remember these, she said. The investigator looked at her. Then you remember the complaints. Linda hesitated. I remember reports. That is not the same thing. She looked down. A complaint became a report became a review became a closure. Each step sounded harmless when separated from the person who had suffered. Another email appeared. Linda's own words were highlighted. Review quietly. Avoid unnecessary attention. She closed her eyes. I was protecting the company. A former employee shook her head. You were protecting the company from the truth. Linda looked toward her, but the woman did not look away. The room had changed. Nobody was rushing to defend Linda anymore. One executive quietly gathered his papers. Another asked for a copy of the records. A third remained silent. Linda understood what that silence meant. They were no longer protecting her. The investigator placed another complaint on the table. This passenger reported racial treatment 5 years ago. Linda read the name. Another file followed, then another. Different airports, different employees. The same pattern, she whispered. We thought they were isolated. The investigator answered. You were told they were connected. Linda had no response. For the first time, she could not blame Victoria, customer service, regional managers, or confusing procedures. The decisions had reached her desk. She had signed them. She had allowed the complaints to disappear. Olia's humiliation had not created the system, it had exposed it. Linda lowered her eyes. I should have looked closer. No one answered. That silence was enough. Her explanation was gone. Now the evidence spoke louder than her explanations ever could in that room. The room waited for Daniel to finally lose his patience. After hours of testimony, eyes turned toward him. Reporters leaned forward. Executives sat rigidly in their chairs. Some expected anger. Others expected the millionaire to use his influence and demand consequences. Daniel remained still. Olia looked at him. He gave her a small nod before facing the panel. I could tell you what I own, he began. I could tell you who knows my name. I could tell you how many airports use systems my company helped build. He paused. But none of that should matter. The room became quieter. Daniel looked toward Victoria, then Linda. My daughter did not need anyone to know who her father was. His voice stayed even. She needed someone to believe her. Olia lowered her eyes. Daniel continued. When she walked into that cabin, she had a valid ticket. She followed instructions. She answered questions respectfully. That should have been enough. Nobody interrupted. I've heard people say this became important because she is my daughter. That's not true. Her being my daughter made the story easier to notice. It did not make what happened to her more wrong. A former passenger nodded quietly. Daniel noticed there are people who don't have investigators. They don't have lawyers waiting beside them. They don't have companies that can demand answers. Sometimes they have nothing except their word. He looked around the room, and if the system only listens when someone powerful speaks, then the system isn't fair. The words settled over everyone. Daniel took a breath. I taught my daughter that money can open doors, but money should never decide who deserves respect after they walk through one. Olia looked at him. He smiled. Briefly then, his expression became serious again. I could have called one person and ended someone's career. I could have demanded public apologies. I could have made this about revenge. He shook his head. That would have solved my anger. It would not have solved the problem. Victoria looked down. Linda remained silent. Daniel continued. My silence was never weakness. I stayed quiet because I wanted facts before accusations. I wanted records before headlines. I wanted to know whether this was one person's decision, or a system that had learned to protect the wrong people. The investigator beside him closed a folder. Daniel looked toward the former passengers. And now I know. His voice softened. It was bigger than my daughter. The room remained still. It was every person who complained and was told they misunderstood. Every employee who saw something wrong and stayed quiet because they needed their job. Every manager who chose a clean report over an honest one. Olia quietly reached for his hand. Daniel held it. I don't want special treatment for my family, he said. I want ordinary treatment for everyone. No applause followed. Nobody spoke. The room simply sat with his words. For once, Daniel's wealth was not the strongest thing in the room. His restraint was. The room had barely settled. After Daniel's statement, when a phone vibrated, what is that? An operations manager stepped closer. Compliance. Alert. The words appeared across the network dashboard. Critical. Compliance verification required. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Linda stared at the screen. Who activated it? The manager shook his head. It wasn't manually activated. Daniel remained seated. Olia looked at him. Daddy, I don't know yet. Supervisors called regional offices. Regional offices called airport managers. Within minutes, the alert appeared at locations hundreds of miles apart. A senior executive rushed into the room. We need to stop this. Marcus looked up. Stop what? The restrictions. Why are they happening? We're still finding out. Another screen changed. 3 airports. Then 7. Then 20. An operations director whispered. They're multiplying. Nobody laughed. The uncertainty was becoming real. Fear at the first affected airport. Departures slowed as automated systems demanded additional compliance checks. Gate agents received instructions to remain calm. Ground crews waited beside aircraft while supervisors searched for answers. A traveler asked, is there a security problem? We're experiencing a temporary operational review. Is the flight safe? Yes. Then why can't we board? The agent paused. I don't have more information. That answer traveled through the terminal faster than the official message. Executives gathered around the larger screen. One man pointed at the network map. This has to be Daniel. Marcus answered calmly. Do you have evidence? He controls the technology. He doesn't control the findings. The room went quiet. Linda finally spoke. This isn't revenge. Everyone looked at her. She swallowed. The system is responding to something. Nobody asked how she knew. She already understood. For years, the company had treated warnings as inconveniences. Now the infrastructure was forcing those warnings back into view. More airports turned red. 40. 60. 90. The phones never stopped Social media post appeared on Marcus's screen. Why are airports shutting down? Another followed. Is this connected to the first-class incident? Then another. 152 airports. Marcus stared at the number. It's spreading publicly. Linda looked away. Daniel received the same update. His legal advisor entered quietly. Daniel, the network is reporting 152 affected locations. Aaliyah listened. Does that mean they're closing? Some are restricted, Daniel said. Some may suspend operations. She looked worried. People are going to miss flights. Daniel nodded. I know. Then this isn't a victory. No, he said. It isn't. He looked at the map. This is a warning that became impossible to ignore. By midday, the number 152 appeared across every operations screen. The room fell silent. Linda remembered the old complaints, the audit, the emails, the warnings, all those years. Everyone had believed problems could be contained inside reports. Now the consequences were moving through airports in real time. Daniel stood. Find out exactly what failed. His team nodded. And protect the passengers first. Outside, travelers waited for answers. Inside, the airline finally understood that the system was no longer hiding its failures. It was exposing them. The headline appeared before anyone understood what it meant. 152. Airports temporarily shut down after system-wide compliance failure. Passengers stared at phones and departure screens. Managers stopped pretending the delays were ordinary. What happened? A traveler asked. The gate agent looked at the message on her screen. We're waiting for instructions. Is there a safety problem? We don't know yet. Across the network, the same uncertainty spread. Executives who had spent years controlling difficult stories suddenly had no simple explanation. The number 152 was no longer buried inside an operations report. It was on every screen. Departure boards changed. Again. Cancelled. Delayed. Restricted. Gates emptied as employees received instructions to pause normal procedures. Some passengers became angry. Others simply stood with their bags, watching workers whisper among themselves inside headquarters. An executive slammed a folder onto the table. We need a statement now, Marcus answered. A statement won't restart the airports. We need to control the message. We need to understand the failure first. Nobody answered him for years. Controlling the message had been enough. Now it wasn't. Aaliyah watched the coverage from a quiet room beside Daniel. The television showed crowded terminals and confused travelers. She looked at her father. Is this because of what happened to me? Daniel shook his head. No, your experience helped uncover the problem. It didn't create the problem. People are missing flights. I know. She watched a mother trying to calm her child near a closed gate. Then how is this justice? Daniel paused. Justice isn't about making innocent people suffer because someone else did wrong. Aaliyah looked back at the screen. That answer stayed with her. Later, investigators released a clarification that changed the public conversation. Daniel had not ordered the airports to close. No private command had been issued. The restrictions began because critical compliance records could not be trusted after the investigation exposed serious failures, a reporter asked. So Mr. Carter didn't shut down the airports? The investigator answered, no. The system required the restrictions. Another reporter asked, could the failures have been prevented? The investigator paused. That is what the investigation is determining. The answer was enough to quiet the accusation of revenge. Executives who once dismissed complaints as isolated incidents stopped appearing before cameras. Former employees began sending additional documents. Passengers posted old complaint numbers and screenshots. People who had once doubted the stories began reading them differently. One former traveler wrote, I thought it was just me. Another replied, it happened to my family too. Aaliyah saw the messages, but said nothing. Her father sat beside her. Shutdown had not erased what happened to her. It had exposed what others had experienced for the first time. The public understood that the airport crisis had not begun with a headline that had begun years earlier, in quiet complaints that nobody wanted to hear. And now those forgotten voices were impossible too. Silence. The silence that once protected the system had finally become its loudest warning ever. The headline appeared before anyone understood what it meant. 152. Airports temporarily shut down after system-wide compliance failure. Passengers stared at phones and departure screens. Managers stopped pretending the delays were ordinary. What happened? A traveler asked. The gate agent looked at the message on her screen. We're waiting for instructions. Is there a safety problem? We don't know yet. Across the network, the same uncertainty spread. Executives who had spent years controlling difficult stories suddenly had no simple explanation. The number 152 was no longer buried inside an operations report. It was on every screen. Departure boards changed. Again. Cancelled. Delayed. Restricted. Gates emptied as employees received instructions to pause normal procedures. Some passengers became angry. Others simply stood with their bags, watching workers whisper among themselves inside headquarters. An executive slammed a folder onto the table. We need a statement now, Marcus answered. A statement won't restart the airports. We need to control the message. We need to understand the failure first. Nobody answered him for years. Controlling the message had been enough. Now it wasn't. Olia watched the coverage from a quiet room beside Daniel. The television showed crowded terminals and confused travelers. She looked at her father. Is this because of what happened to me? Daniel shook his head. No, your experience helped uncover the problem. It didn't create the problem. People are missing flights. I know. She watched a mother trying to calm her child near a closed gate. Then how is this justice? Daniel paused. Justice isn't about making innocent people suffer because someone else did wrong. Olia looked back at the screen. That answer stayed with her later. Investigators released a clarification that changed the public conversation. Daniel had not ordered the airports to close. No private command had been issued. The restrictions began because critical compliance records could not be trusted after the investigation exposed serious failures. A reporter asked, "So Mr. Carter didn't shut down the airports?" The investigator answered, "No. The system required the restrictions." Another reporter asked, "Could the failures have been prevented?" The investigator paused. "That is what the investigation is determining." The answer was enough to quiet the accusation of revenge. Executives who once dismissed complaints as isolated incidents stopped appearing before cameras. Former employees began sending additional documents. Passengers posted old complaint numbers and screenshots. People who had once doubted the stories began reading them differently. One former traveler wrote, "I thought it was just me." Another replied, "It happened to my family too." Olia saw the messages, but said nothing. Her father sat beside her. Shutdown had not erased what happened to her. It had exposed what others had experienced too. For the first time, the public understood that the airport crisis had not begun with a headline, that it had begun years earlier, in quiet complaints that nobody wanted to hear. And now those forgotten voices were impossible to silence. The silence that once protected the system had finally become its loudest warning ever. News commentators quickly turned Daniel into the villain. He shut down the airports. One analyst said. Another called his actions an abuse of influence. Daniel watched the coverage without responding. The accusation was easier than discussing the failures that had existed before his daughter boarded that plane. Olia sat beside him. "Are they angry at you?" "Some are. Why?" "Because blaming one person is easier than facing a system." Across the network, executives began distancing themselves. Former supporters stopped returning calls. Even people who once praised Daniel quietly suggested he should use his influence to reopen the airports. He refused. When reporters finally reached him, Daniel agreed to speak. "I did not close those airports," he said. A reporter interrupted. "But your company controls the systems." "My company provides technology. It does not decide whether compliance requirements are met." "Then why haven't you ordered the airports reopened?" Daniel paused. "Because passengers deserve to know the systems are safe before they trust them." The room became quiet. He looked directly into the cameras. "My daughter should not have needed my name to receive respect, and I will not use my name to demand special treatment now." Olia watched from the side of the room. Daniel continued, "If accountability only exists when someone powerful is hurt, then it is not accountability." The statement spread quickly. People who had expected threats heard something else: restraint. Later, Daniel met with his advisors. "They want the airports open," one said. "I know. Every hour costs millions." Daniel nodded. "Then the cost of reopening too soon must be considered." Another advisor frowned. "Daniel, this could become financially devastating." He looked at the investigation files. "So was what happened to those passengers." The room fell silent. Daniel approved independent inspections and refused to pressure investigators for faster results. As days passed, more records surfaced. Former employees sent documents. Managers requested legal advice. Executives who once dismissed complaints stopped defending the old system. Nobody announced a revolution. People simply stepped away. Olia noticed the change. "Why aren't you happy?" Daniel looked at her. "Because people are still waiting." The airports remained restricted while independent teams examined compliance. Records. One inspection revealed another weakness. Then another. Each discovery delayed reopening. Public frustration grew, but Daniel refused to interfere. "Profit can wait," he said. "Passenger safety cannot." The sentence became a headline. For the first time, the public understood the difference between Daniel's power and his purpose. He could have demanded revenge. He could have destroyed careers. Instead, he demanded evidence. He did not shut down the airports. Because his daughter had been humiliated, compliance failure had forced the restrictions. Olia finally understood that the crisis was no longer about her alone. Daniel looked at her. Justice should leave people safer than it found them. Outside, the terminals remained quiet. Inside, old privilege was losing its protection. For once, nobody could hide behind polished statements or chosen words. The records were visible, and the consequences were impossible to move. "You need to clear your office by 5. Linda looked up. "Who authorized that?" "Security disabled your access." She stared. Nearby workers were carrying boxes from her office. "After everything I did, the board accepted findings." Linda gave a smile. You all wanted me to protect a company. Now you're pretending you never asked. Victoria received her disciplinary notice. You're suspended pending final review, her supervisor said. Victoria swallowed. I followed procedure. You followed your judgment. It was a concern. Then why did her documents prove you wrong? Victoria looked down. I didn't know who she was. You shouldn't have needed to. The words stayed with her. Meanwhile, executives began resigning. Some claimed they had followed instructions. Others admitted they had known something was wrong. Daniel listened as an investigator. Describe departures. They're calling it restructuring, the investigator said. Daniel shook his head. Call it what it is, a culture. Yes. Olia sat beside him. Does this make you happy? She asked. No. Then why keep going? Because removing people is easy. Changing what taught them to behave that way is harder. Daniel turned toward the investigators. New leaders must protect employees who speak up. Every complaint must be traceable. And nobody gets to decide a passenger deserves less respect because of how they look. Olia nodded. Daniel continued. I don't want another child standing where you stood, wondering whether she belongs. Silence settled over the room, Olia said. Then maybe something good can come from this. Daniel looked at her. Maybe, he said. But only if we change what happens next. Outside, headlines spread the story of the airline's collapse. Inside, the people who had protected the system were disappearing. The empire was cracking, but Daniel knew its fall was not the victory. What mattered was what would replace it months later. Olia walked through the same airport doors. For a moment, she remembered everything. Ticket, please. The employee held out a hand. Olia passed it over. The ticket was scanned once. Thank you. Have a good flight. She waited, expecting another question. None came. That's it? Olia asked softly. The employee smiled. That's it. She nodded and moved toward first class. Nobody recognized her. Nobody knew Daniel Carter was her father. Nobody knew her experience had helped uncover failures across 152 airports. And Olia liked it that way. Near the gate, a black family approached with their luggage first class. The attendant asked. Yes, the father answered. The tickets were scanned. Welcome. Aboard, the family thanked him and walked through. Olia watched them disappear into the cabin. No questions. No suspicious looks. No demand for proof. Just a welcome. Her chest tightened. Daniel noticed. You okay? He asked. Yeah, you should. She smiled faintly. They didn't have to prove anything. No, he said. They shouldn't have. Olia looked toward the runway. I used to think justice meant making them understand what they did to me. Daniel said nothing. Now I think it means making sure somebody else doesn't have to explain why they belong. He nodded. The airport was not perfect. Olia knew that. People could still make mistakes. Bias did not disappear because policies changed, but complaints were recorded. Decisions could be reviewed. Employees had ways to speak without fear. The silence had changed. Before, silence protected the powerful. Now, silence could no longer hide everything. Olia picked up her bag. Ready? Daniel asked. She looked toward first class. Yeah. Then she walked inside. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her. Nobody needed to know her father's name for once. Being treated like everyone else was enough. Workers stepped forward. I was scared, one supervisor admitted. Of losing your job. She nodded. Of becoming the next problem. Another employee spoke. I knew something was wrong. I saw a black passenger questioned after his documents were confirmed. Why didn't you report it? The investigator asked. The woman looked down. Because I watched what happened to people who did. They were transferred. Their schedules changed. Promotions disappeared. Another employee opened a folder. I kept these. Inside were emails, complaint notes, and scheduling records. I didn't know why I saved them, he said. These show employees were encouraged to protect the company's image, the investigator said. They never had to say, stay silent, we understood. Daniel listened. Not everyone here was cruel, he said. Some people were afraid. A former employee looked toward him. Does that make us innocent? Daniel paused. No, but it explains how the system survived. Silence filled the room. Then another woman raised her hand. I want to speak. She described a passenger being humiliated years earlier. Another employee followed with a similar story. The testimonies connected, revealing a hidden pattern. Olia watched near the back. Her experience had opened the investigation, but now something larger was happening. People who once whispered in hallways were speaking where everyone could hear them. One employee looked down. I thought I was the only one. You weren't, another answered that. Simple reply changed the room. For years, silence had convinced them they were alone. Now every voice made the next one easier. The system was not changing because people ordered it to. It was changing because employees decided that protecting one another mattered more than fear. And for the first time, speaking up no longer felt like standing alone. The last employee finished speaking, and the room slowly emptied. Victoria waited until everyone had gone before returning to the locker room. She walked past co-workers who once smiled when they saw her. Now they looked away. Victoria, she stopped. I just came for my things. Victoria said. I know. Victoria opened her locker. Her name tag was still there. I thought they would at least let me say goodbye, her colleague answered quietly. You already had your chance. Victoria looked at her when Aaliyah was standing there. Victoria reached for the uniform hanging inside. Her fingers touched the sleeve. Aaliyah's voice returned. Why did you believe I didn't belong? Victoria closed her eyes. I don't know. You knew enough to stop me. Victoria looked down. I thought I was doing my job. No, her colleague said. You thought you were right. The uniform had once made her feel certain. People stepped aside when she wore it. Supervisors trusted her judgment. Now it was only fabric. She removed it and folded it carefully. I keep thinking about that day, Victoria whispered, the moment she looked at me. She wasn't angry, Victoria continued. She looked confused, like she couldn't understand why I had already decided who she was. A final employee stopped near the doorway. Victoria, I should have said something that day. Victoria looked at him. So should I. He nodded once and left. She placed the folded uniform inside the box. There was no crowd waiting outside, no cameras, no shouting. Just an empty hallway. Victoria carried the box toward the exit at the door. She turned back. Her locker stood open. The name tag was gone. For months, she had feared losing her position. Only now did she understand what she had actually lost. The uniform was never the source of her authority. The silence around her had been. That silence was gone. Victoria lowered her eyes and walked away. Behind her, the airport continued moving. Passengers arrived. Employees welcomed them. First-class doors opened and closed. Nobody stopped the mourning for her. That ordinary movement hurt most. Justice had not needed a spectacle. It had simply removed the protection she once believed would always remain. Victoria reached the exit and paused. I hope she never has to remember me again, she whispered. Then she left. The hallway felt smaller now. The airport doors opened, and Aaliyah stepped inside. For 1 second, the old memory returned. The gate, the stairs, Victoria's voice telling her she did not belong. Aaliyah slowed. You okay? Daniel asked. She nodded. I am. They walked toward first class. At the entrance, an attendant reached for her boarding pass. Aaliyah's shoulders tightened. The attendant scanned it. Everything looks good. Aaliyah waited. No question came, no suspicious glance. No call for security. The attendant handed the ticket back. Thank you. Have a good flight. Aaliyah looked at her. That's all. The attendant smiled. That's all. Aaliyah nodded and stepped forward instead. What surprised her was the absence of anything happening. Nobody asked who purchased her ticket. Nobody questioned why she was sitting in first class. She reached her seat and placed her bag beside her. Daniel sat across the aisle. You don't have to say anything, he told her. No. She looked toward the cabin entrance. Dad, yes, it's strange. What is... Nothing happened. Daniel gave a small smile. That's what should have happened the first time. Aaliyah looked through the window. She remembered the girl she had been that day. She had felt embarrassed and suddenly smaller because someone else's assumption had become her problem. But it was no longer her identity. A black family entered the cabin behind her. Their tickets were checked, and the attendant welcomed them without hesitation. No special treatment, just dignity. She smiled as the aircraft prepared for departure. Aaliyah leaned back and closed her eyes. She touched the armrest and breathed slowly. The cabin felt ordinary now, and that ordinary feeling carried more meaning than any apology ever could. The victory was not that she had returned, it was that she could finally stay. This time, nobody made her prove that she belonged. The first runway lights returned before sunrise. One airport at a time. Gates reopened, ground crews moved, and passengers began boarding again. Are we really operating? A traveler asked. Yes, an employee answered, but things are different now. The passenger looked at him. The employee paused. We're supposed to listen now. That answer followed Aaliyah in the days after her return to first class. The airports were moving again, but nobody could pretend the shutdown had changed nothing. Old complaints were reopened. Files once buried in private inboxes were placed before independent reviewers. This was called a misunderstanding, an investigator said. And this one, same, and this. The investigator nodded. Same pattern. Across the network, employees remembered why they had stayed quiet. I was afraid, one former worker admitted. Afraid of what? Losing everything. Another employee answered differently. I knew speaking up mattered. I just didn't think it would change anything. Now the old silence felt different. It no longer looked harmless. At newly reopened terminals, managers received updated procedures. Serious complaints had to be documented. Independent teams could review decisions. Employees had safer ways to report misconduct. One supervisor stared at the new instructions. So we can't handle these ourselves anymore. Not when you're part of the complaint, the reviewer said. The supervisor nodded slowly. For years, authority had meant control. Now authority came with scrutiny. The industry began facing the cost of looking away. The crisis had not started with one employee or one passenger. It had grown through ignored warnings, weak oversight, and people who learned that staying quiet was easier. Daniel watched the first full day of reopened airports from his office. His advisor smiled. We made it through. Daniel shook his head. No, we learned something. What? That surviving the crisis isn't the same as fixing what caused it. He looked at a screen showing aircraft leaving different airports. Alia's flight was among them. She can fly without being questioned now, he said. That matters. Daniel nodded, but the real test comes when nobody knows who she is. Across the country, planes rose again. The terminals looked normal. The schedules moved. The gates closed. Yet the old system had not returned with them. The airports reopened because operations were finally safe enough to continue. This time, silence could no longer be mistaken for peace. The industry changed because accountability had become impossible to ignore. Aulia sat beside him. Do you think they'll remember? She asked. What happened? Everything. Daniel was quiet. They may forget the headlines, he said. They may forget my name. That doesn't feel fair. No, but justice isn't always about being remembered. Then what is it about? Making sure the next person doesn't need someone like me to be heard. I still remember standing there, she whispered. I kept thinking I had done something wrong. Daniel shook his head. You didn't. Money can open doors, Aulia. It can make people answer faster. It can get attention. But money should never decide who deserves respect. Aulia looked at him. That is why you didn't destroy Victoria. Yes, well, because removing one person wouldn't fix what taught others to behave the same way. So everything you did was bigger than me. It started with you and ended with everyone. That was the hope. Then Aulia asked, what if people forget? Then we keep building something worth remembering. What do they need to remember? Daniel paused. What they did, what they learned, and what they must never allow to happen again. But the lesson remained. It lived in every new rule, every honest complaint, and every employee who chose courage over silence. From now, her father had never fought to prove that a billionaire's daughter deserved a seat. He had fought to prove that nobody should need a billionaire standing beside them. Her name might disappear from the news. Daniel's might too. But if one frightened passenger was treated with dignity because of what happened, then the struggle had meant something. They stood together and walked toward the door. This time, nobody needed to open it for them. The room had changed before Aulia returned. Linda's office stood empty. Her name was gone from the door, her files removed, and people who once waited outside now passed without slowing. Victoria's name had become a warning, whispered between employees. She knew better. One worker said she thought nobody could question her. That was the problem. Across the company, leadership began changing. Decisions once buried in private meetings now required independent review. Former employees admitted what they believed. We thought the institution would protect us, one said, if we followed orders and stayed quiet. But it didn't protect everyone. No, he replied. It protected itself. That sentence traveled far. Words that softened harm began losing power. Policy, procedure, misunderstanding, isolated, incident. Investigators placed those phrases beside complaints, emails, and witness accounts. Do you still call this isolated? One asked an executive. He looked at the documents. No, powerful people began checking decisions before someone else did. A manager reread an old complaint to approve disclosure. Nobody answered. Then someone said, I did. And why? The manager lowered his eyes. I thought it was better for the company. That answer revealed what had been hidden for years. The empire was never just Linda, Victoria, or the executives. It was the belief that powerful institutions could control the story, protect their own, and decide who deserves to belong. Daniel understood removing people would never be enough. Aulia understood it too. They didn't give me dignity, she said quietly. Daniel looked at her. No, he answered. They finally stopped trying to take it away. That was the change. Respect. It was no longer something the institution could grant or that had never needed permission to belong. She had always belonged. The system was simply learning what should have been obvious from the beginning. Months later, the airport looked ordinary again. Families hurried toward gates. Aulia stood near first class. Do you notice anything? Daniel asked. Not at first. Then a black family approached the entrance. The father handed over their boarding passes. The attendant scanned them. Welcome. Aboard. No suspicion. No questions. No manager. The family continued forward. Aulia quietly watched them disappear into the cabin. They don't know, she said. Know what? What happened before? Daniel nodded. That may be the best part. Employees had learned to look beyond assumptions. A passenger's appearance was no longer a reason to demand explanations. Questions had to come from facts, not instinct. A passenger submitted a report expecting silence. Instead, an independent reviewer called. We received your complaint. We're reviewing the records. Passenger paused. You actually called me? Yes. For years, that answer would have sounded impossible. Now it was becoming routine. Managers knew their decisions could be examined. One supervisor asked, what happens if I make a mistake? You correct it. And if I hide it? Then the hiding becomes part of the investigation. The supervisor said nothing. That was the new reality. Former passengers began receiving calls about old complaints. We reviewed your case, an investigator told one woman. What happened to you mattered. Aaliyah noticed the changes without taking credit. Nobody recognized her, nobody thanked her. She preferred it that way. Does it feel different? Daniel asked. Yes, how? People don't have to know my name anymore. Daniel smiled. The airport was not perfect. People still made mistakes. Bias did not disappear overnight. But now complaints could be heard. Authority could be questioned, and unfair decisions challenged. Oli walked toward her gate. Her story was becoming invisible, and that was the victory. The change no longer needed her name to survive. Olia walked into the airport without anyone noticing. She was another passenger, carrying a small bag toward the gate. Familiar sounds brought everything back. The questions, the staring, the voice telling her she did not belong. Olia stopped. You okay? An employee asked. She looked up. Double quotes. Yes, I'm fine. The employee smiled. Good morning. How can I help you? Olia handed over her boarding pass. The employee checked it once. Everything is good. No second look, no suspicious pause, no question about who had paid for the ticket. Thank you. Olia said. You're welcome. Have a good flight. She walked away slowly. Nobody knew her father's name. Nobody knew Daniel Carter's influence had exposed failures inside the aviation system. Nobody knew one humiliating. The encounter had changed policies across the network, but she understood that doing so would change the meaning of the moment. If the employee treated her differently because of her father, then nothing had truly changed. So she kept walking at the gate. Olia looked through the glass at the aircraft waiting on the runway. She remembered the girl she had been months earlier. That girl had wondered whether she belonged. Now Olia knew the answer had never depended on a powerful name. Her father could open doors. It was always hers. His wealth could force people to listen. His influence could expose what others wanted hidden. But none of that created her dignity. Olia sat down and watched passengers move through the terminal. Nobody recognized her. Nobody stopped her. Nobody needed to. Dad was right. She whispered. The strongest victory was not feared. It was being treated fairly when nobody knew who you were. In that ordinary moment, Olia finally understood the lesson her journey had taught her. Dignity was never supposed to have a price tag.